Hello again, everybody. It's Laurie White from the Greater Providence Chamber of Commerce, and welcome to episode number 80 of Chamber TV. And today we're talking about innovation and technology and a national survey that was just conducted, which takes a look at all of the states and determines which state is best positioned to excel in the knowledge economy. And here today to unpack this very meaty topic is our good friend, Rob Atkinson. And Rob is the president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation based in DC. And we are thrilled to have him with us today to talk about the 2020 New Economy Survey. And this is a survey that bears traditionally some very good news for Rhode Island, particularly in the last few years, as our rankings have continued to improve. So I look forward to getting into it deeper with Rob, and hopefully we'll shed some new insights on what Rhode Island is doing in terms of building the knowledge economy and being able to be a global player in that. So with that, let me welcome Rob. How are you today? Nice to see you again.
Hi, Laurie. I'm doing very well. Thank you.
Fantastic. So we chatted a couple of months ago about some of the work that your foundation has been doing. But for those of you that may have missed it, let me ask Rob to just share very, very briefly what the ITIF is all about and what some of the work that you're doing encompasses. So tell us about it.
Sure. So ITIF is the top-ranked science and technology policy think tank in the world. And based in DC, I started it in 2006. And our mission really is to explore for policymakers a whole set of technology questions. What are the most important technologies and what should policymakers at the local, state, and federal level do to maximize technology innovation, whether it's for jobs or for other purposes like better health or better environmental conditions.
How is it that you are able to start such an illustrious organization right from scratch and catapult up to be the foremost expert in this field? That's pretty cool, very ambitious.
I could flippantly say it was good because we didn't have a lot of competition at the time. And that was partly true. When I started ITIF in 2006, believe it or not, there weren't that many think tanks or other people even thinking about these questions that much. So we got in the market, if you will, at the right time. The second factor is I've just been so lucky getting, I have a great senior leadership team that really are just fantastic, and they're very productive and prolific and really great analysts and writers. So I think that helps. We've done really, cutting edge work in so many different areas that policymakers, not just in the United States, but really all around the world have come to look to us for what our thoughts are on these issues.
So do governments or sovereignties actually hire ITIF to take a look at different vexing questions and challenges?
Sometimes. A lot of our work is supported by foundations or companies, but not for individual projects, just overall support. And then we weigh in on particular issues that we think are important. But sometimes governments will give us funds. For example, the Canadian government has funded us to look at smart manufacturing policy and how Canada can do well there. We've gotten some funding from the National Institute of Standards and Technology here in DC about manufacturing and how the US can lead and what we need to do. So occasionally governments will ask us and enlist us to do analysis for them and give us our thoughts on what they should be doing.
Well, some of the most auspicious news coming from you is that you most recently, before taking on this very important role, were here in Rhode Island. So you're very familiar with the Rhode Island economy and its strengths and its challenges and really the arc of its economy over a long period of time.
Yeah, it's funny. I started to do this report, which we call the State New Economy Index, back in 1999. Soon after I left Rhode Island. And the idea was, how are states doing in making this transition to, at the time people used the term new economy. It's sort of an old term now, but an economy that's more knowledge-based, more digital, more tech-based, how are states doing? How do they rank up? How do they stack up relative to each other? And so we've been doing it about every 3 or 4 years, I guess, since 1999. So this is the eighth report that just came out a couple of weeks ago, or a week ago.
Okay, so let's dive right into it and give us the top line analysis as to how Rhode Island is faring in this new economy.
Sure. So I could put it in different ways. In the long term, in 1999, 20 years ago, Rhode Island ranked 29th, and now you rank 23rd. That's down just a tad from 2017, where Rhode Island ranked 20th. I wouldn't really read too much into that. Sometimes that's just it's about how some of the data sets we have, they change the methodology on them, so states can go up or down a little bit. But were some areas where Rhode Island has done, particularly well, and other areas, frankly, where, there were some challenges. So I can go through some of that if you're interested, but happy to do that.
Let's paint a big picture. So first, you broke it down into a number of indicators, and then among those indicators, you rolled them up into 5 specific sections or factors, if you will. So why don't we go through what the large 5 big buckets were and just define them, if you will, and then we can talk about each one.
Sure. So the 5 areas, really, the first one is knowledge jobs. In other words, what share of the Rhode Island economy is made up of jobs that require, some level of skill? It doesn't have to be a PhD or something. It could be a technician skill, but jobs that have some level of technical skill to them, because we feel those are really the most important jobs, particularly as we compete with foreign countries that have, an advantage in just low wages. The second area is globalization, how well linked, both in terms of exports and foreign direct investment, the economy is. Some people will argue, well, maybe that's not as important now because maybe we're at peak globalization. I think I don't think that's quite true. I think globalization is going to still be important. Export markets will still be important. So the third area is economic dynamism. In other words, how much is the state economy changing? How many new firms are being formed? How many inventor patents? How many fast-growing firms? Because that's a really important factor. Sure, states should be able to retain and grow existing firms, but unless they can keep adding new firms and in new industries, they're going to fall behind. The fourth area is digital economy, an area that obviously keeps growing in importance. How much do the most important sectors of the economy use technology, or how broadly available is technology? So we look at things like e-government and broadband telecommunications and health IT. One thing I would just add is it is so difficult to get really good data on some of this stuff from the U.S. government, in part because the Congress, frankly, doesn't give them enough money to do these studies the right way. So, one would like to know, for example, how much investment in technology and computers and software Rhode Island firms invest relative to other states. There's no way to know that. The government might have some of that, but they won't release the data at the state level. And the last area, the fifth area, is innovation capacity, which sort of maybe what people, I think, find the most interesting. Things like high-tech jobs, in other words, jobs in the high-tech sector, scientists and engineers, patents, industry R&D, venture capital. So those are the 5 areas, and we weight each indicator, a little bit differently to stress the most important ones. But it gives I think, a generalized picture. As I said, I wish there were better and more data to really dig into some of this, but we do the best we can.
So within the 25 indicators that comprise the 5 macro factors, if you will, where did Rhode Island fare the best?
Oh, that's a good question. Hold on here. Yeah. So let me just look here. I can go through this quickly. I have each one per score, but I can it's harder at the, wait a minute here. So Rhode Island did well in knowledge jobs. It was in the top quartile of states. There are actually only 6 or 7 states in that. It's quartile by score, so not the number of states. So it did well in terms of knowledge jobs. In terms of globalization, it actually didn't do well. It's actually near the bottom in globalization, particularly exports. Rhode Island really lags when it comes to exports.
I noticed that was particularly pronounced in the manufacturing sector, which surprised me a little bit because Rhode Island's manufacturing prowess is said to be quite good.
There's again, this all goes back to how the government collects the data. So if oftentimes manufacturers in Rhode Island are not what are called final goods producers, they're intermediate goods producers, and so they might sell a component to another manufacturer who then sells that somewhere else. And let's say that widget that a Rhode Island manufacturer puts into the component and the component is sold to Germany, that doesn't get counted as a Rhode Island export. It gets counted as a Connecticut export, let's say. So some of that you have to take into account. Is it because Rhode Island firms aren't as focused on exports? Rhode Island firms tend to be smaller, and that smaller firms export less. And if they're more intermediate goods as opposed to final goods, then that would also lead to lower exports.
High wage traded services, how are we faring in that area?
Well, that is what we're trying to do there is look at how well does Rhode Island do in services that are traded across state lines. So in other words, I always remember, I won't say who it was, but there was someone when I was there who was applying to be a high-level economic development official. And he explained to me that he thought barbershops were just as important as software firms for Rhode Island. And I had to differ because I said it doesn't really matter whether our barbershops are competitive or not. People aren't going to drive to Seekonk to get their hair cut. They'll get their hair cut in where they live, in Pawtucket or in Cranston. But whether we have enough traded sector service jobs like the Fidelities of the world or Citizens Bank of the world, those are ones that are really important. So service jobs that are traded across state lines and that pay above the median wage nationally. So those are really important parts of the economy. And Rhode Island actually does pretty well there. Rhode Island ranks 8th in the nation. And this is, by the way, as a share of overall number of jobs, not absolute. And it actually went up 10 points just in 3 years. So it was 18th, and now it's 8th. So that's very strong performance.
Of course, Massachusetts ranks number 1, and Massachusetts has ranked number 1 since you've been doing the survey going way back, right, to 1959.
Yep. Every year.
Consistent performance at the top of the heap, top of the 50 states. Talk a little bit about that and the degree to which you may or may not be surprised by that consistent ranking.
I remember one time I was testifying in the Senate on, I forget even remember what the hearing was on, and it was Senator Kennedy, Ted Kennedy, obviously before he passed away, and he was very proud of the index, and he held it up and actually sent out a copy to a dear colleague copy to all 99 other senators. So yeah, Massachusetts has done really, really well. In part for some of the reasons you would expect. They're number 1 in the nation in knowledge jobs. So I mean, think about that. You got Harvard and MIT and other universities, and people tend to stay there. And you've got all the high wage, the Fidelities of the world, and investment banks and software firms and the like that employ a lot of people like that. Let's see, where else do they do really, really well in high tech innovation, as you would imagine. So, for example, in innovation capacity, they're number 1. They're number one in high-tech jobs as a share of the economy. People often think that's California, but what you forget about California, California is so much bigger and diverse than Massachusetts. You've got LA, you've got the Inland Valley and Modesto and other places like that. Massachusetts is much smaller, and a bigger share of that economy is is high tech, if you will. Patents, they're number 6. Industry investment they're number 4. So venture capital, they're number 2 next to California. So Massachusetts just has this really strong ecosystem where they've had it for a long, long time, having a lot of defense spending back in the days after World War II, and then all through the Cold War. That really helped to build up that capability. It helped them build up some of the government labs and the what's called FFRDCs and big tech firms and universities. And so, they continue to build off of that. Biotech is a great example in Kendall Square, where they're really a biotech powerhouse. So I always thought when I was in Rhode Island working for the governor that better linkages and closer linkages with Massachusetts was really important for Rhode Island, because you're sitting right next to a global powerhouse.
Yeah, I was just going to, delve into that. Folks might think, well, we share a common border. We're both relatively small states. We can drive from here to Boston in roughly an hour. Why is it that the borders aren't more porous, if you will, in terms of knowledge jobs and the innovation environment that would make it a real cluster?
Yeah, I mean, I said this once too. I was talking to some New Hampshire officials, and I said this once, and I got in trouble. I said, I shouldn't say it that way. I said, a main reason you do as well as you do is that the 495 tech corridor happened to be north of 90, not south of 90. And if it was south of 90, I think Rhode Island would have done much better. In other words, a lot of the high tech that migrated outside the city and went out to, whatever, the inner beltway and then the outer beltway was really more near New Hampshire. And so it was easier for that to migrate up to New Hampshire. People would commute to there. So that's one reason, I think, is just geography.
Route 128 beltway, is that?
Yeah, 128. Yeah, you had 128 as the inner and 495 as the outer. So that made it a little bit farther, maybe 15 miles farther, and rather than 15 miles closer to Rhode Island. I always said, and I just don't know what the case is now, but I always thought that, trying to build more suburban commuting neighborhoods or housing developments in northern Rhode Island, where, the cost of housing in Boston in the Boston region is, so out of touch for so many people, that if you could build a, nice housing in northern Rhode Island, and then have have a train station close by and just hop on the train and get into whatever part of Boston you need to go. I thought, that might help. But at the time, again, I don't know what's happened since. At the time, there was a lot of local resistance to development, and that made things worse. I think also it could be, one of the things that I was trying to get the state to do, and I don't know whether it was a good idea or not. I thought it was at the time, but there was some lab space at that place by the river. I'm sorry, an incubator in Providence. And I thought, maybe getting
Richmond.
Getting wet lab space, sort of, really discounted wet lab space for some of the biotech firms. Maybe you could get some to come down. So, I don't know. But I think it's still something that's worth, focusing on, because there's just so much activity going on up there.
Mm.
I'll say one other thing also, and it's not a knock on Brown, but it's more of a saying. MIT, if you look at MIT, they are so good at transferring and commercializing technology. I was looking at a list of programs they have, and they have over 70 programs, I believe, 70 programs that help an entrepreneur, help a student build a new company, help somebody who's outside MIT to come in and access the technology. And, that's just a powerful tool or weapon. I think someone did a study. They showed the companies that have spun off of MIT would have had the GDP combined of like the 5th largest country in the world. And I don't, again, MIT is unique. I get that, but emulating some of that, I always thought would be a good thing to do. And certainly Rhode Island's done a lot of that. I'm not trying to be critical. It's a hard thing to do, but a lot of the different policies and programs that the current governor has done and others in the legislature are certainly really good steps to move in that direction. But maybe more.
Governor Gina Raimondo, of course, has been a fierce advocate for knowledge-based economy growth. And in fact, the chamber and her office and Commerce have been working very closely for a number of years on a bunch of strategies that would help improve our rankings, not just in the New Economy Index, but in all of the rankings that are prevalent today. So as part of it, we have done some fact finding, and I think Rob, you and I may have talked about this the last time we were chatting here on Zoom, but the comparison to MIT, and we visited as a group the folks at MIT to understand, their secret sauce and what was exactly in their institutional DNA that made them such a powerhouse. And as you know, and folks that are familiar with MIT know, it's written right into their charter when MIT was founded, that their purpose in life, their total purpose for everything that they do, and again, embedded in their charter, is technology transfer. So it's not really an afterthought, if you will. It's something that the faculty is very, recruited purposefully for, and the students understand that, and the rest of the community understands that, and the various federal labs understand that. So some of it, who knew back then, right? This was even long before, the 128 Beltway expansion. All of that was a direct result of MIT being purposeful about technology transfer. So you really have to have that as a mindset.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a report I was involved in a number of years ago called Innovation U, the letter U 2.0. And which you can find online pretty easily. And we looked at, I think, the top, what we thought were the best 16 colleges and universities in the U.S. in terms of commercializing technology. And Laurie points right on the mark. It's not hard to figure out what to do. You can read that book. There are other books. It's really about, can you incorporate that as a core part of your mission? And that's really what I think distinguishes places like MIT or University of Utah, Caltech, Stanford. They really have it as part of their mission, and it permeates how the faculty think of things, how the deans think of things, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's talk a little bit about Utah. They have become in recent years a technology and innovation powerhouse, and you saw a lot of that start to happen after the Olympics were there. People understand that California is always going to be very prodigious in this area, and other places, DC, Virginia, that has access to the Pentagon and all the federal labs there. But what about Salt Lake City? What did they do in recent years that is pointing, very favorably to their growth?
So I'm going to speculate on one thing, just because I know a couple of CEOs out there, and that is sort of religion and culture. Obviously a very strong Mormon state where a lot of the folks who are Mormons, they don't want to move. They want to stay in their state, in their community. And so you take a state like Illinois or something, or other states of the Midwest that have, really smart people as well, and they graduate with a degree. A lot of them move. They'll go somewhere else and they lose the talent. Where Utah, there's a lot more people that stay and want to start companies. And once you had that, you start to get some critical mass. The other thing is that the governor, the governors and the legislatures have been very focused on making principally University of Utah, but other universities there, big drivers of commercialization. So again, they've put in place a lot of incentives and a lot of programs. They evaluate the universities not just on how many papers did you get published in a journal, but what are you doing to help the Utah economy with technology spin-offs or licensing or commercialization, startups. So that's again, you wouldn't think of a place like Utah maybe because University of Utah is good, but they're not. You don't think of them as in the top 10 or so. So again, part of it's just they've just decided they want to do that. The other thing too, Utah is Salt Lake City in particular, nice place to live. You can get up into the hills and ski pretty quickly. So and that's obviously something that Rhode Island has too. I mean, you certainly have that advantage as well. You can go boating. You can go to Block Island. It's a little harder to do this kind of stuff in a state in the upper Midwest where it's just where it's cold and you don't have skiing or you don't have the ocean. Let's put it that way.
Well, a lot of the infrastructure was built up to support the Olympics, and there was a lot of cash left over, from what I understand, and that was obviously put to good use. So I want to talk a little bit more about Rhode Island and its performance. But before I do that, I want to talk about another border state and ask about Connecticut, ranked above Rhode Island, Mass and Rhode Island. So what is going on to the south of us that would be of interest, and how is their trajectory?
Yeah, so sure. Connecticut ranks 9th. They were 10th, so they went up 1 point. Again, one of the interesting things to think about with Connecticut's really 2 states. It's the suburbs. Well, it's maybe 3. It's the suburbs of New York, and there's a lot of folks live there, and there's a lot of money there, and increasingly a lot of good technology jobs. ITIF hosts its own podcast, and we just interviewed. Let me find out his name here. For our latest podcast is a really great biotech company up in Connecticut. And the reason he started, it's a company called Loxo Oncology. And we were talking to the CEO, Josh Belinker, and Josh used to be in New York City, but he lives in Connecticut. And so he started this biotech company, and he said, I want to start it up where I live. So that's a big factor where you just have a lot of folks like that. And then they have Yale as well. So for example, I'm just looking at Connecticut ranks 4th in knowledge jobs. It ranks 3rd in managerial, professional, and technical jobs. I think the other thing, it ranks 5th, for example, in manufacturing value added. So it has very, very high tech manufacturing. Good example, United Technologies. Pitney Bowes is headquartered there, so that gives it a leg up as well. And then in terms of things like innovation capacity, it ranks 12th, but on some other factors, like on patents, it ranks 5th. So, again, I think that's the problem, frankly, with an index like this is you're comparing apples and oranges, because New York or Connecticut's really 3 things. Massachusetts is 2 things. It's the whole Massachusetts high-tech corridor, and then you've got Western Mass. Rhode Island is smaller, obviously, so it's kind of more one thing. And I think that may be one reason why you see that spurt in Connecticut.
It was my understanding that Connecticut was having some challenges relative to, like, for instance, General Electric moving its headquarters to Boston, and others, even skipping over Rhode Island and moving to Boston to be part of that ecosystem, where you think of Connecticut more like around defense, General Dynamics, and, as you mentioned, Pratt and Whitney and others, Pitney Bowes. Talk a little bit about the various strengths and pockets in the Connecticut economy and how you see Rhode Island being able to, delve into that and to really be part of that share of the innovation economy.
Yeah, before I do that, I just want to mention, there was a study that we did, ITIF did with Brookings Institution last fall, and we looked at high-tech concentration in the country. And what we found was actually pretty troubling. About, as I recall, 90% of all high-tech job growth in the last 10 years was in 5 areas. 4 of them, if you include San Francisco and San Jose as one, Seattle, Boston, and I can't remember the other one now. But the point is, we're seeing a big concentration, and that's why GE went to Boston, because, okay, everybody else is in Boston. We should go to Boston because everybody wants to be in Boston. And that works for a while, but it can stop working when the cost of living becomes so high. You see that in Silicon Valley now, for example, where I was there a few years ago and I was driving up El Camino Real Road, and sort of the main drag in Silicon Valley that's not the freeway. And I saw all of these trucks with little campers on the back. And I asked somebody I was with, hey, what's that all about? And he said, well, that's where the software engineers live. They don't make enough money to afford an apartment. I mean, they make a lot of money, but apartments are so expensive there. My son just got a job out there in a software company. And he pays more for his rent for his little studio apartment than I used to pay for my mortgage here in Bethesda, Maryland. So that is something I think ultimately could be an advantage for Rhode Island, particularly now when you really look at the fact that the COVID economy has clearly shown to companies, you don't have to have all of your workers in the office 5 days a week. So, for example, there are lots and lots of software companies now that are saying you only have to be there 2 days a week, or some are even saying you don't have to be there at all. And if you think about that, to me, it suggests a really important opportunity for Rhode Island. There are a lot of people in Boston who, they're in some cramped apartment or something like that. And if you have the right zoning and housing policies in Rhode Island, hey, you maybe only have to go up to Boston 2 days a week, hop on the train or drive up there 2 days a week, live in beautiful Rhode Island, get all the advantages of that, lower housing costs, better quality of life. That seems like it's a big, big opportunity. I think this is actually a permanent change. I really do. And I think it could change how people look at a place like Rhode Island, where before you had to be right in Boston. And I don't know that you have to do that. With your question on Laurie, on Connecticut, I think the problem with Connecticut and Rhode Island connections is that a lot of the Connecticut economic engine is really in the western part of the state, the southwestern part of the state. And, it's still somewhat hard to get there. You can take the train, that's true. You can drive down 95. But at least the last time I looked, is it 6 or whatever that goes into Hartford? It's not a freeway, and it takes a little bit of time. So I don't know. It seems harder to integrate with Connecticut than it does with Massachusetts, just because it's closer.
Yeah. So we're talking about the COVID phenomenon and having a certain equalizing effect, if you will, the great equalizer relative to working at home, and you don't need to live in a very expensive area like Silicon Valley, where the price of housing is so prohibitive, and in many respects, Boston is the same way. So Rhode Island having an advantage of that, because our housing stock is not as pricey as some of those places. Getting pricier. I think every place is sort of in the, that's in the suburban areas, seeing some spikes in housing stock because of people trying to leave the big cities and going into areas that are more remote. But so your point around the density here and being able to attract workers who can be working from, working any place, and to bring that same sort of knowledge economy, density and dynamism back to Rhode Island. So tell us a little bit about how, if you were a king, if you will, how you would go about reinforcing this message and getting this message out to key influencers.
Well, I mean, I think, I think it's something akin to COVID. I think is a really a wake up call, and I mean, leaving aside the pandemic and the terrible tragedy of the disease, from a sort of business and transformation perspective, I think it's very, very important. I don't think business travel is going to come back the way it did for a long, long, long time. Companies now know that you can do these things. I mean, I was just reading that Microsoft Teams is rolling out a whole new set of improvements, and in response, Zoom is rolling out a whole new set of improvements. And, you know, these technologies are only going to get better. We, you know, in a few years, frankly, sooner, we could be using virtual reality or augmented reality to communicate with each other. Certainly the bandwidth that we have. In fact, Rhode Island, by the way, ranks fantastically in broadband. I think you're second in the country. So that's really that's another big plus, by the way, for doing this. If you don't have good broadband, it's a lot harder, obviously, to do this. So I think that, you know, the technology has finally gotten there, and now the company attitudes and the worker attitudes, I think the worker attitudes, frankly, have always been there. That's not to say that everybody wants to do that. It tends to be that younger and single workers, on average, don't want to do this as much, but married workers with children, high levels of interest in being able to live that lifestyle. So I would just explain, you know, I'm trying to get people in Rhode Island to understand that it's not just about recruiting companies anymore. The fact that you're near one of the greatest knowledge worker hubs in the world, even if you just recruit them, the people, they're spending money. And then at the same time, maybe they get tired of their company up there and they want to start their own company, and they'll say, hey, I want to start it in Rhode Island. I think, though, there's a couple of challenges or important steps that have to be done. One, Laurie, you mentioned housing prices. You know, a lot of that, frankly, is regarding local zoning and restrictions. Again, I'm not speaking for Rhode Island because I don't know it now like I did 20 years ago, 20 years ago this was true. Maybe it's not anymore. But, you know, I would think about, is there a way to enable, you know, a lot of really new and fun condos along the river or near the bay, where people would be like, oh, this is such a cool place to have a condo. And then market that to people in Boston, for example, or in the northern part of the state, really nice housing developments where people could, you know, have maybe an acre of land or 3/4 of an acre of land or whatever like that might be. And then, you know, the other thing, the last thing is really, if you ask knowledge workers where they want to live, what are the factors that matter to them? One of the most important things is schools. And you know, it's funny, I was talking to somebody the other day, I won't say who it was, in Rhode Island, and we were having a conversation about what Rhode Island can do. And, you know, and I mentioned that I live in Montgomery County, Maryland, 1 million people who live here, and there's one school district. And that does lead to, you know, significant savings, efficiencies. They're able to have really great, you know, folks that think about what kind of education, what kind of reforms, what kind of innovation. Now, you know, that's not going to change in Rhode Island overnight. I get that, but figuring out ways to get the K-12 system to be better, I do think that's really, really important.
Mm-hmm. Well, Commissioner Angelica Infante Green has been here on the ground now for about a year, and she has made it her quest to really help the community understand that these rankings, these poor rankings, are totally unacceptable, and to engage all segments of the community and stakeholders in the reform process. And then COVID happened, and all the remote learning and all the learning loss, and those are huge issues, not just in Rhode Island but across the country. But certainly they're exacerbated here when you're starting from a weaker place, if you will. So back, let me just ask you about the data collection process. Is the data the product of the pre-COVID world, or were you collecting the data consistent with, beginning in March when things began to change a little bit. Do you think if the data were collected today, right in the middle of the pandemic, with some of the indicators more, built in, that the results would look any different?
Yeah, I mean, one of the problems when you're trying to collect data on all 50 states that's not just anecdotal, you have a delay in terms of what you're looking at. A little bit like looking at a star that's gone supernova. You still see the star, but it's blowing up. Here, most of the data is on average probably 2018. So there's some that might be 2019. There's some that's 2017. So we're really looking at 2.5 years old, and I wish it was different, but that's just the way in most of these cases. Oftentimes this is the only data you have are federal data sets from the various census of either the population census or the business census, and they're just slow. So, and by the way, that I think is an important statement, because in a lot of ways that doesn't reflect the last couple of years of Rhode Island's leadership, the governor's leadership and the legislature's push on this. So, that's why when we do it again, and then, but that's a few years from now, you'd sort of see where Rhode Island is / today. I don't know where Rhode Island would be, frankly, in terms of, there are just so many different factors in that of, what share of your economy is just quote unquote an office economy. There was a recent study that just showed that I think over half of U.S. GDP in the last quarter was produced at home. You think about that. I don't know how that can be, but that's what some economists claimed. But certainly a big share. ITIF, all of our output is now produced from home.
All right, so half of the U.S. GDP in the last quarter was produced at home.
That's what this study said, something like that. Yeah.
Kitchen tables.
Yeah. I mean, but also it's when you call up or somebody at Social Security and say, hey, what's going on with that? They're probably working at home remotely. I mean, so many companies have transformed their system, so all their front office people, their call center people or whatever, are now working at home. A lot of their managers and sales, marketing, design. I mean, my son started at a tech company in Silicon Valley. He was there for 1 week in the office, and then they didn't shut down, but they moved everybody to work from home. He's been working from home for 9 months now, and he's making software. So I don't know whether that's good for Rhode Island, relative or not. I just can't say.
Yeah. Thinking about all the things that you measure in your index and putting on this new mantle of, work from home is going to probably consume a larger portion of the GDP than before. Which of the indicators, if you were us, do you think is the most important to focus on and to really get correct, to get right? Which indicator should we make sure that we get absolutely 100% spot on?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And normally for a state, I would say broadband. But when you look at Rhode Island broadband, let me just find it here.
We're number 3, right?
Number two.
Number 2.
And that is, by the way, that is a measure of the number of the share of the population, the share of households in Rhode Island that subscribe to broadband, and the speed of the broadband, which is obviously super important now that you can have, 4 people all trying to do a Zoom call at home. Probably the whole amalgam of knowledge jobs. For example, Rhode Island did well on immigration of knowledge workers. So in other words, workers that come to this country, there's data on how much education they have. Do they have high school degree, a college degree, a bachelor's, a master's degree? And Rhode Island actually did quite well there, but dropped down when it came to migration of U.S. workers. In other words, people from one state moving to Rhode Island and people moving out. So those would be areas where I'd really kind of be keeping an eye out in terms of how is the state doing as a reflection of this sort of, post-COVID world where knowledge workers become this really key asset.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, you were referring to it as internal migration. So I wasn't exactly sure if that meant, necessarily people, churning within the state, bringing people back in, families moving back in, people coming back from university after
Yep.
they, far flung someplace else.
Yes, that would include any time. So if somebody's in Rhode Island, in 2015, and then they decide they want to move near their cousin in New York, then that would be an out migration of a person. 2015 at University of Albany or something, and they move back to Rhode Island to get a job, that would be in migration. Mm-hmm. Not related to immigration, but in migration domestically. Yeah.
Yeah. What is the status of venture capital in this country today?
Well, actually pretty good. When you look at the latest data from a company called PitchBook, what you find is that there's been this long increase from essentially right before the Great Recession. That venture capital is up probably 3 or 4 times. I'd have to go back and look at the numbers, but they're doing quite well. And the other 2 interesting things about venture funding, which is really a little bit different than the trends we saw 10 years ago, is the biggest increase in venture funding is zero and first stage capital or seed capital, the sort of earliest stage, smallest stage, riskiest stage. And that's super good, especially for Rhode Island, where you're wanting to incubate new companies completely, and they might not go for a $40 million or $100 million round, but they might need a $10 million round. The fact that the venture community is putting more money into that, I think, is really good. And then the second thing that's been good is that, I mentioned before that Massachusetts is second, California's first. There's an awful lot of venture concentration there, but on overall, venture funding has become a little bit more dispersed. So it's growing faster outside of Massachusetts and New York, and California than it has been. So that suggests sort of more opportunities for places like like Rhode Island, where you might be focused on smaller deals and you're not in Boston or Silicon Valley.
Do you think the life sciences and pharmaceutical companies will now be soaking up all the VC dollars, given the aftermath of the pandemic and the rush to design novel drugs?
I want to say that so badly because, we're poised at this brink of biopharmaceutical innovation that's going to be so important. Like there's a company I know of that just got a bunch of funding in Silicon Valley. Grail, that's the name of the company, like the Holy Grail. But what this company does is, I think it's a blood test, or I'm pretty sure it's a blood test. It might be blood and saliva, I don't know. But you do this, and they can screen with a high level of accuracy up to, again, I'm going to get the number wrong, 30, 40 different kinds of cancers in really early stage. So a lot of cancers, you don't notice you have it until you see some symptom like a lump or other things. And oftentimes by then it's in an advanced stage, which makes treatment much more difficult. This company, by using, genetic and genomics and other nanotechnology, whatever they use, it's really a potential breakthrough where you do this test and you get screened for 30 different cancers. It's phenomenal. So there's all this incredible stuff that's happening. Big data analytics for new drugs. CRISPR, in other words, genetic engineering. What I worry about, though, is that there really is a strong push, particularly among Democrats, for drug price controls. And there's no doubt in my mind that if we go down that path, especially if we go way down that path, there's going to be a lot less money for drugs. Companies won't have as much money. They won't be able to make as much money. Can cost up to $2 billion to bring a new drug to market. if you can't make that back through pricing, you're not going to do it. That's not to say that we don't have a drug affordability problem and that government couldn't do some things about it. But I really worry that if we go down that path, venture could actually, be reduced in that sector.
Mhm.
So I don't know. I mean, you got two things going on. You got the technology, which is enabling an enormous number of innovations and new companies, but you also have the pricing policies potentially that would help, that would hurt. I mean, that's one of the reasons the U.S. is the leading biopharma innovator in the world, is because we've got good pricing policies.
Mm-hmm. The trade-offs that come later when they go generic.
Right.
So let's
Exactly.
this up. We are almost at the top of the hour, but Rob, I wanted to ask you, I love your backdrop there. I love the fact that you are looking so comfortable and you have so many interesting things in the background. So what is someone like you who heads a foundation and a prominent think tank, how do you spend your day, and what do you get your head into during the course of the day? What are you studying? What are you looking at? What are the key hallmarks of a Rob Atkinson day?
Well, I get up, I eat breakfast, and I commute upstairs up my 14 steps up to my office. And then at the end of the day, I go jogging with my 14-year-old daughter, who keeps me motivated. But in between, I've been really focused on three big things for me. One is the challenge from China on technology, which I really think is very, very serious. My colleague David Moschella and I, David's with a group called Leading Edge Forum, is based in Boston. We just wrote a report on that, arguing that the biggest disruptor probably of this decade isn't necessarily technology in a lot of industries. It's going to be China. So I think about that a lot. I also have been thinking a lot about how the U.S. can maintain its technological advantage and why that's so important, not just for good jobs and innovation, but also for our defense base. I think we have a weaker defense industrial base than a lot of people think. And I think we've got to really, take a step and do that. One of the things I'm really optimistic about, though, Laurie, is, I was in Rhode Island for 2 wonderful years. Was super happy that the legislature and then again under Governor Almond's leadership, they really put in place a set of policies that were, very, very important, like the R&D credit, and created the Slater Fund and some other things. The federal government hasn't done that as much. They tend to sort of walk, they don't think they need their own economic development policies, but that's beginning to change. You're seeing bipartisan efforts. Senator Schumer, Senator Coons, both Democrats, Senator Todd Young from Indiana, Senator Marco Rubio, Florida, a number of other senators, Senator Cotton, all sort of now saying, wait a minute, we've got to really take U.S. technology and competitiveness seriously. So I'm hopeful, actually, that we're on the cusp of some really interesting new policies to help us compete. And if we do that, those are going to, really help places like Rhode Island do a better job. There'll be more resources to help with state programs. There'll be just more innovation that companies in Rhode Island can take advantage of. So I'm hopeful that'll happen. And, it'd be great if the Rhode Island delegation, which I'm sure they would, get behind it, because I think we've got to really do that. I'll just give you an example, the research and development tax credit. When I was in Rhode Island, I was really proud that the legislature and Governor Almond put that in place. It was the highest and most generous R&D tax credit in the country. But now the U.S. overall, its R&D tax credit compared to other countries is relatively anemic at the federal level. And even in Rhode Island now, we have a new study that we just ranked all the states on R&D credit. And Rhode Island's no longer number 1, it's number 3. Connecticut is ahead and Georgia's ahead. So that might be something also for the legislature to look at. We calculated a little tweak, actually, a little bump up looks like it could get Rhode Island back up to number 1 in R&D credit, which, I think is useful for no other reason than bragging purposes, bragging rights.
Yep. Good idea. We'll write that down. All right. So you have your head into China, you have your head into defense innovation and the political dynamic around that. So what is the third thing that that is enthralling you these days with your beautiful attic location here?
It's this whole, big picture, I guess, this whole movement towards what people, I don't know, what some people call the fourth industrial revolution. I don't really like that term, but, the whole emergence of technologies like 5G and artificial intelligence and autonomous systems, autonomous cars, robots, et cetera, et cetera. It's a big deal, and it's exciting. And I'm really, a transformation of retail. Retail is going to look very different in 10 years. More automated, more electronics, et cetera. I think a lot about that, and think in particular about how do we make sure that people either aren't scared of it and want to oppose it for that reason, or just don't like it because it challenges their own interests. I think, what made the U.S. the greatest country in the world, and I think we're still the greatest country in the world, but what made us the greatest country in the world were, we embraced change. Americans were always about the future. And I worry that we're losing some of that today. And we're looking at technologies with, how is it going to be bad, rather than how we used to look at it, which is, this is going to be great. And we'll figure out what to do if there's any problems as we go along. So I think a lot about that. And how do we make sure that we, that we continue to move forward aggressively with these technologies that are going to be so good for all of our lives and our kids' lives.
What are your go-to places when you emerge for the morning? Like where do you go to gather your info? Give us a sneak peek behind what you do and where you go to keep your mind fertile.
Well, it sounds funny, but one place is I have a lot of people I follow on Twitter that I get a lot of good insights from in new studies that come out. For example, actually, a good example of that on this other one, I'm debating some MIT professor, and I think in a couple of weeks, because he wrote a recent study, the MIT Center for the Future of Work, I believe, they wrote a study saying that we have too much, automation is too fast, and therefore the government should impose taxes on companies that buy machines or buy computers or buy AI. Something I adamantly oppose. I think it's a terrible, terrible idea. So I read things like that. I try to read things there that perhaps don't agree with me, because I want to understand how other people view this.
Yeah.
I like McKinsey Global Institute. I learn a fair amount of things from reading McKinsey. There's some colleagues and friends there that I like their work, but it's really kind of all over the place. Different. I can't say there's sort of one particular place I go to.
Yeah. Well, so many topics, so much that we could get into. We could talk about the relative value of a growth economy versus a sustainability economy, but we will have to save that for another time, Rob. So thank you so much for sharing your insights with us on the New Economy Index and Rhode Island's performance, and areas where we can certainly redouble our efforts to continue to improve. And again, even capitalize more fully on where we do have strengths, particularly in the innovation and the telecommunication space and the information highway, and the investments that have been made in our infrastructure there, which allow us to rank number 2 in the country. So we will build on that. Rob Atkinson, president of the Innovation, Technology, and Innovation Foundation, thank you so much for being with us. And I know we'll be back to you again very soon to continue the dialogue. So in the meantime,
thank you, Laurie.
Take care.
All right, you too. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.